back in 1980, if you wanted a huge fucking bell at the start of your album, you'd just have one made. Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video, and this is going to be another installment in my series Revisiting, where I look back on one particular record, which seems to have some resonance for me personally. But today I'm delighted to welcome a very special guest, the VC's very own Steve Whitty. Hi Steve.
Hi James. Hi everyone.
Superb. So we're going to look at today an album which I know is very special to you, Steve. Do you wanna, should we hold it up now? And
Yeah.
not that it's any surprise, obviously, because it'll be in the title of the video, but yeah, we're going to look at AC/DC, Back in Black. And so the reason that we're looking at this record really does relate back to you, Steve, and I guess you should explain what significance this album has to you.
It is my favourite album of all time. The reason I love it so much is whenever I hear it, when I finish listening to it, it always leaves a smile on my face, despite the circumstances that led to the album. It's just a joyous celebration of life.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that word joyous, because I just listened to it again just now, and the word that did come into my mind was joyous. And it's interesting because in the past, I didn't necessarily, it's not a word I would necessarily have thought of to describe the record. I think that's partly because when I first got into AC/DC, I think this was the first album that I heard by them. I was at school, and to me, they seemed like quite a kind of hard, uh, slightly scary band, I guess. They were the
Yeah,
first proper sort of hard rock band I got into. And I guess back then I would have listened to it and just thought, wow, this is heavy stuff, this is like heavy music. But now I listen to it at this distance, in my 50s, and what I do hear is this great kind of joy that seems to be
yeah,
coming through the music, just a great sense of jubilation, which is remarkable given the story behind the record and where it came from in their career
yeah.
and what had just happened. I mean, we'll get onto the history in a moment. So when was the first time that you heard the record? Can you remember hearing it for the first time or buying it, or had you been
The
a fan
first time,
already?
first track I heard was "Shoot to Thrill," and Radio One used to have a program called Roundtable, and that's when I first heard the first track. The first track I heard was "Shoot to Thrill," and they played it on Roundtable. It was Peter Powell was on it, Ted Nugent was on there, and both commented on how loud and heavy. And I listened to the track and I thought, wow, this is great. I've got to have the album. I was obviously aware of AC/DC because I had brought Touch Too Much, the single that came out prior to Bon Scott dying. So I was aware of them, and I was really getting into them. I thought, I need to save my pennies up, pocket money, in order to get the album. And I did buy an original copy in 1980. It has long since disappeared. The copy I've shown you is a reissue. I don't know what I did with that copy. Might have played it to death and then thought it just became a frisbee or something like that. I don't know. But as I say, I've got two versions on CD. One was just the CD version, but when they reissued the box set, did the box set Bonfire, which was all the Bon Scott stuff tribute, they did include a remixed version of Back in Black in there. So I have got another two copies on CD there.
Cool, good stuff. Well, I think my copy is my original one, but I didn't buy it at the time. I got into this record on cassette, and it was probably in about 1982, 83. I'd gone to secondary school and I hadn't really heard any sort of heavy rock music, particularly at that point. Maybe I'd heard Rainbow, I don't know, but they were sort of pop. They were definitely pop,
Yeah,
rock, metal, weren't they? And I don't know, I was ready for something a bit more challenging. And some of the lads in my class were into AC/DC, and they were always drawing the AC/DC logos on their exercise
yes,
books. That was the thing I really
yes.
remember, and it just looked so good, this logo. And I thought, yeah,
I did the same. Did the
yeah, yeah,
same.
I did too. Yeah, yeah. And remarkably, a friend of mine, I think he lent me this cassette of Back in Black, but I got a feeling he might have given it to me. I mean, God knows why. Maybe it was his brothers or something. I don't know. But I seem to remember ending up with this tape of Back in Black. It was a proper shop bought version of it. It wasn't a home tape thing. And I had a Sony Walkman, or a Sanyo Walkman, to be exact. And I've got a very clear memory of listening to it for the first time on this Sanyo Walkman and hearing the bell at the start of Hell's Bells, going into that guitar, and just thinking, wow, this is this is a bit different from what I've been used to listening to. It's not argy bargy by Squeeze, it's definitely got a bit, more of a dark thing going on. And so yeah, I was probably a little bit behind you. If you bought it in 1980, I was probably about two years, maybe even 3 years behind you. So, but I think you are older than me, aren't you? Slightly, Steve,
I
just
like those
slightly.
a little bit older than you.
Yeah, okay. So let's, before we start talking in detail about the music, let's go over a bit of history, shall we? So clearly, the thing we should say, and obviously this is not going to be news to anybody watching this video, is that this was the first album after the death of Bon Scott, who had died of alcohol poisoning. I think was the official
Yes,
thing on
yes.
the death certificate. And famously, AC/DC did not really pause for breath, really. They were just, I think it was because they were at that point in their career where things were really about to take off for them, or things possibly were taking off already.
Highway to Hell was particularly really broken in the States. It got to top 20 album in the States. I think the introduction, and we'll probably may mention it, Mutt Lange as producer, which was at the assistance of the American record company, sort of polished off the rough edges while still keeping the power. And I think that built up on that. There were a band that were on the rise. It was. It felt like that. They were on the rise, particularly in the UK as well. They had a couple of Top of the Pops appearances as well. I think the reason they carried on was more the assistance of Bon Scott's family. At the funeral, did say he would want you to carry on, and because I think obviously you have to remember at the time, about 40 years ago, the young brothers still. I mean, Angus might have only just turned into his 20s, and Malcolm would have been mid-20s at that time. So they were still like young men, and you know, sort of Bon sort of schooled him a little bit in the ways of rock and roll. He was that battle-hardened rocker that been around in the 60s and the early 70s in bands, and so he sort of like was like a mentor to him and almost like a father figure to him. So I can imagine that when he went, they felt that loss hard.
Yeah, there must have been a real void there. And I was just reading about it now online, and it said that Mutt Lange himself was the person who suggested Brian Johnson. Does that accord with what you think? Because I'd never heard that particular story before.
I've never heard that because the reason Brian Johnson came up was the fact that Bon Scott was a big fan of his. He'd mentioned he'd seen him on live, and he was ripping into it on the stage, really screaming his lungs out. And apparently Brian Johnson said, "Yeah, I remember that show." He goes, "I've got appendicitis at the time. I was in agony."
Yeah, I remember that story.
Yeah, so but the guys were aware of Brian Johnson. I mean, there was obviously a few vocalists that turned up, but I think with Brian Johnson, and I actually need to say a few vocalists mentioned. There was even mention of Noddy Holder was being asked to join at one point because obviously he's got the lungs for it, but.
And not too dissimilar a voice. If you listen to some of those Slade records, very harsh, shrieky kind of voice. I mean, the story I heard was that one of the things that really endeared Brian to the others was that he came in and just immediately started shooting pool with them. You know, he was incredibly personable, and I think they sensed, because it was interesting because obviously he wasn't Australian like them, so he was sort of an outsider coming in. He was from Newcastle. He'd been in this band called Geordie, who'd never really made it, although they had, you know, they made a couple of records, I think, but they never really got a big audience. But
I think at that time, Brian Johnson, I think, was sort of like he was doing a version of Geordie, but it was sort of like doing the clubs up north. He was working as a mechanic. I think he had to borrow the money for the train fare to get down to London for the audition. You know, he really right down. I think his marriage was failing at the time, or some of the personal life wasn't great. I just think everything was just going wrong, and this sort of like was manifest. Also, the thing that impressed the band was when he came in. What was the first song they did? He said, "Let's play Nutbush City Limit." Now, when they'd auditioned all the other previous vocalists, they were all going, "Well, can we do Smoke on the Water? Can we do Whole Lot of Love?" You know, stuff that you know the band could play in their sleep, in a sense. So Brian Johnson came in and said, "Let's do a song that's totally different." Some that they liked, and they thought, "Yeah, we got a kindred spirit here."
That's a really interesting point. I think what they did share was this love of older music. I know that Angus Young and Malcolm Young, they were really into a lot of kind of early blues people, but also jazz as well, kind of
Yeah,
early jazz, things like Basie and that kind of thing, which you can hear in their music. I always think that there's
yeah,
there's there's a hell of a lot more to them than just a kind of rock band. They've definitely got some roots there, and I know that Brian Johnson, he's a big fan of Louis Armstrong.
yeah.
So again, they've got that kind of shared awareness of kind of older forms of music, I guess. So yeah, I mean, it was an incredible moment for him. He always said that he dropped the phone when he was told, because I think Malcolm phoned him back.
Yeah, yeah,
I've even got a date here because I saw it on Wikipedia, the 29th of March, 1980, apparently. And if you bear in mind that the album was done later that year. I mean, it came out on the 25th of July,
yeah.
1980. So I mean, you're talking about an
And
incredible turnaround in this
short,
guy's
short
life.
turnaround because Bon Scott died in February of 1980. So
Wow, wow, okay.
within less than 2 months, they'd found their replacement.
Yeah,
Then
yeah.
started rehearsing. Then they whisked themselves off to the Bahamas to record the album.
Yeah, so I've got just a couple of funny little stories here, and no doubt you've encountered them too. So they went to the Bahamas, to Compass Point um, Studios, and it was the monsoon season, so it was pissing
Yeah,
it down with rain, and they were housed in a series of concrete cells or concrete bunkers. And Brian Johnson famously said that he'd forgotten to bring a book with him, so he was he was sort of sequestered in this sort of concrete bunker with the rain coming down outside, nothing to do in between, sessions. But they had this cleaning woman who warned them that there were these robbers in the area who are breaking into these bunkers and stealing people's things. So she lent them all a series of 6 foot long fishing spears to ward off these burglars. So Brian was kind of hunched in this little cell with his 6 foot fishing spear. Monsoon season, no book, nothing to read, and it's just an incredible story. And God knows what was going through his mind in the studio. Apparently, Mutt Lang really put him through his paces, drilling
yes,
him as he drilled Bon Scott as well on Highway to Hell, really teaching him how to breathe, insisting that he did
yeah.
things like,
I've been reading that story today. It's sort of like
yeah,
you've got knowing where to put your breaths in, in the right place, and it's sort of like Brian Johnson thinking, I could understand why it was coming from, but I just absolutely hated it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's what's interesting about the team up with Mutt Lang, AC/DC. You think, yeah, it worked. It worked fantastically well. I mean, for
Yeah,
two or three albums anyway. And then it's interesting how they did decide to leave him and forge ahead in a different direction, because in a way, I guess his approach was perhaps not exactly in tune with what they were about, which was just being a very
yeah,
immediate sort of bar band. And his thing was to meticulously craft a studio sound. And
yeah,
his genius, I guess, was that despite it being so calculated, what came out of the other end sort of sort of did sound like a band that was just playing, and yet it
yeah.
was structured.
I think he was smart enough to realise, I'm never going to, I'm not going to, it's not going to be a polished record like I want. But he sort of dragged the band along with him,
Hmm.
and but was smart enough to realise that we've got to keep why they're so good, which was that rock and roll. And I suppose he gave that direction, and particularly at this time, what they needed at that time, because this
Hmm.
could have gone totally wrong. Uh,
Yeah.
you know, with the experience they had. So I think he sort of like helped them through maybe that whole process, grieving, getting together, getting the album together, just as a group. I mean,
Yeah.
Compass Point was quite an studio. Quite a lot of people recorded there during the late 70s, early 80s. It was
Yeah.
quite a popular place to go.
It is interesting, I think, this thing with Mutt Lang, because if they hadn't have teamed up with him on Highway to Hell, I've often wondered if you assume that Bon Scott was going to die anyway, say he died after Power Age, so they hadn't got this thing with Mutt
Yeah,
Lang, would Back in Black have happened in the way it did? I mean, Brian Johnson still could conceivably have joined the band,
he
and
could. Yeah,
it could have been another Vanda Young production, a bit like Power Age. And what would have happened then? Would it have been this blockbuster, or did it need Mutt Lang to be the commercial guy who was going to reinvent them for, FM
I
radio in the States?
it's not the production that makes this record good. It's the songs. I think if they if they come up with the same songs, because it's pretty much, even though it's got young Johnson. It was pretty much Young wrote the songs. I mean,
Yeah.
Brian Johnson contributed a few bits of lyric, and I think Bon Scott might have done the same, but probably did more. I think, as we saw in history carries on with AC/DC, it was more young songs. So I think the songs were there. I think it's what Langer's involvement was. He put them down just and made them sound even better. But the actual songs were there. If the songs weren't there, I don't think this wouldn't be. We wouldn't be talking about this album.
I know that over the years there have been a few different, or there's been a debate about what exactly had been written already. Some people. I mean, for years I was always told, "Oh yeah, Bon Scott had written them, all the words." And I always thought to myself, yeah, I can kind of see that. There are some songs like "You Shook Me All Night Long." There were some lines in that where you think, yeah, that sounds like a Bon Scott line. And then I totally heard the opposite, and it was like, no, 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 because they definitely didn't want to have any kind of overhang from the Bon Scott thing. There is a Bon Scott book out there somewhere which kind of does delve into the history of this, and I think in that book it says something like some of the music existed. Apparently, there's a demo of Bon Scott playing drums on.
Yes, he was a drummer. Yeah, I'd read that there was a basic involvement for a couple of tracks, just basic demos where he was on. That was the whole point why they were in London when he died, was they were working on songs.
Okay. So I assume then that Brian Johnson had been the lyric writer in Geordie, because these are not lyrics written by someone who's never written rock lyrics before, are they?
No.
They're really good lyrics,
there is a quote where Johnson admits it. He was struggling at the start to write lyrics, and I can't remember which song it was, but literally, Hell's Bells. That was the one.
It was the rain coming down, wasn't it? That
rain
inspired him.
He couldn't sleep because of the rain, and so that the idea of the lyrics for that song came from just hearing the rain.
I'm rolling thunder, pouring rain. I'm coming down like a hurricane.
Yeah.
There's just one really funny story I wanted to mention. This is one I just got this morning, although I might have heard it before. This thing about the crab.
Yes, I was reading that today.
So they're playing a song in the studio, and all of a sudden they just look, and there's this huge crab just walking across the studio floor, and they all just sort of stop playing and look at it. I mean, that's it. I mean, that's the story. I just love that. I just wrote it down. Right, crab. There's just something AC/DC like about that story. They have to stop playing because there's a crab walking across the studio. So that's that.
Well, that might be really them going back thinking, "Oh, Crapsody in Blue," isn't it?
Crapsody in Blue, exactly. And also, this is quite a good one as well. The bell which is used at the start of the album, they tried to use a bell somewhere on location somewhere, and it didn't work because all these birds kept flying into the bell apparently and making a mess. So they ended up having a special bell made especially for them for this album, and they ended up recording it on Ronnie Lane's mobile studio. So they must be the only band in history ever to have a huge bell specifically manufactured just in order for it to open the album. What an incredible story.
But that's now an intrinsic part of the live set. You couldn't watch Hell's Bells without the bell coming down and Brian Johnson giving it a good whack.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays, obviously, they just use a sample of a bell, wouldn't they? So there's something great about that story. Back in 1980, if you wanted a huge fucking bell at the start of your album, you'd just have one made, And
in fact, the record company goes, "Yeah, go on.
Yeah, go on.
Get we'll put it down as expenses."
Okay, so let's just get into a little bit of this music now. Now, I've just written down here. I mean, I've gone through the tracks and I've tried to give each song a point out of 10, but don't take that too seriously. I've given some songs 11 out of 10. The opening track, Hell's Bells, I've given 11 out of 10 to. And I've just put here on my notes: is this the greatest introduction to a hard rock album ever? What do you think? I mean, you got the tolling bell, the slow guitar, the build-up.
The slow guitar. Because when I mentioned it's a joyous album, if you just based it on that first open, you'd be thinking, crikey, this is Black Sabbath, Mark. It almost feels like the beginning of Black Sabbath.
Also, John Lennon as well. Plastic Ono Band starts with this tolling bell, which is actually quite similar. Yeah. And then, but of course, that album goes into this absolute, one of the darkest, most tragic songs you'll ever hear. Whereas this, it's just not really what people would have expected, I guess. You know, all these AC/DC fans, and I've heard people, you know, saying firsthand, you know, I went to buy the album, put it on, didn't know what to expect. And this bell comes on, and they're thinking, oh my God, you know, and then the
Yeah,
guitar starts, builds up. But you're still waiting, aren't you? You're still waiting to
yeah,
hear what's
yeah,
this what's this Brian Johnson guy going to do when he finally comes in? And the
yeah,
introduction is so powerful that you think when he finally does come in, he better do something pretty spectacular, otherwise it's going to fall flat on its face. And when he comes
yeah.
in,
And he comes in, and
I
this
mean,
the sound is though it's a bloke gargling acid. Um,
there was a quote
yeah,
from Robert Christgau, said he sounds like he's got a cattle prod at his scrotum.
probably sang a little bit higher if that was the case.
Yeah, but it's high though, isn't it? Really high.
I mean, he really. I think for Johnson, this was obviously he knew this was his big or and his last chance. So I think he was giving it all he got, and with obviously help from Mutt Lange, sort of encouraging him
Yeah.
to really put the vocals in,
Mm.
and I think that in that way that helps the album, because you've got somebody that's really giving it all. You hear it with bands sometimes, they're getting their mill band to a band, album to album tour, and sometimes they don't really give it all in the vocal performance or music. Where Johnson is going for it because this is it. If it fails, I'm back
Mm.
to puddling with cars, you know, in Newcastle. So
Yeah. And of course, he just totally sustains it because you think, well, he's not going to be
yeah,
able to do this all the way through the album. So, I mean, we get to Shoot to Thrill. Now, I've given that one 10 out of 10. I've just put incredible section going into the guitar solo in this song.
yeah,
There's a kind of breakdown. It's so well done, so well arranged. And AC/DC always knew how to set up a guitar solo. There are so many examples of that where it's not just the fact that Angus is going to come in with this guitar solo, it's how it's orchestrated coming into the guitar solo. So when it finally comes in, it really, really packs a punch, doesn't it?
I think with AC/DC, and it's proven by the fact there's hardly any outtakes for them, is when
Mm,
they went into the studio, the songs were pretty much honed in. It was just a case of recording them, maybe a few tweaks here and there, but the actual basis of the song pretty much was all there. And I could well imagine all that section, Malcolm and Angus had worked that out while rehearsing in London before they flew out and signed
mm.
to Mutt. This is how it's going to sound.
I mean, for Def Leppard, he really put them through their
Yeah.
paces and refused to take the arrangements as they'd written them. So if that story is true, that's certainly a
Well,
testament
Malcolm
to,
was quite a drip. It's AC/DC's Malcolm's band.
yeah,
You know, even Angus will give credit to that. It's all. In fact, Malcolm's a better guitar player than Angus. So Malcolm would probably have it in his own mind. This is what it's going to sound like, and he
yeah,
doesn't suffer fools gladly. I can well imagine there was tension between Mutt
yeah.
Lange and Malcolm about this, but I think that they would have gone into the studio recording the album. These songs would have been well rehearsed.
Mm,
I think that the only thing that would need to come out would have been the lyrics.
mm. I think there's a definite sense, isn't there, on this record that the AC/DC formula, they've realized what it is now, and
Yeah,
they're sort of into the refining part of the process where they know exactly how things are going to work. And sort of on this album is where it finally totally just snaps into focus. Just the way they've got this thing, there's like certain little ticks or certain things that they do, and they really do them a lot on this record. That thing where they do like a really choppy riff, but then they start playing the same riff but with sort of longer hanging chords instead, so it goes
yeah,
from this sort of choppy thing to a more kind of sustained long
yeah,
ringing chords.
yeah,
And there's just certain things, and Phil Rudd, he's really sorted out his drumming.
yeah,
He's got these two crash cymbals, he's got one there and he's got one there,
yeah.
and he's going back and two between them, and there's nothing random about his
No,
his cymbal crashes. He's like that one, then this one, then that one. It's
yeah,
really, really well done, orchestrated.
yeah. But it's just the whole thing is just sounds so tight, and that's probably what attracts me to AC/DC in the first place. There's a
Yeah.
tightness to that. It's
Mm.
Angus can go off and be whatever he likes on his solos, but your basic rhythm of Malcolm, Phil Rudd, and Cliff Williams. It's just
Yeah.
I think it's the greatest rhythm section in rock. They knew their roles. but it's so tight, that rhythm section.
Mm.
It's just what makes it.
Talking of Brian, so the next track, "What You Do for Money, Honey," yeah, is that right? Track
Yeah.
3. Has got, so I've given this one, I think I've given this one 9 out of 10, or is it 10 out of 10? I think it's 10 out of 10. The outro, there's this brilliant bit where Brian sings "What You Gonna Do," and Angus,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, because he'd already got that sorted out with Bon Scott. You know, Angus and Bon had
Oh,
already got
I
this
mean,
incredible
yeah.
symbiosis. It's
Yeah.
weird how
Yeah.
it's almost like Brian had always been there, or that Bon had just passed on this kind of psychic baton to him, you know.
Well, Brian was a big fan of AC/DC prior to him joining, so so I think he knew that,
Yeah.
that if it's going to work, it's got to work with Angus. To me, this song sounds like it's a Bon Scott lyric. It's
Yes.
some, because that's a bit. I mean, okay, the title doesn't these days wouldn't really go down too well, but
What You Do for
it's
Money,
got that
Honey.
little glint in the eye that Bon Scott always had, that little cheeky glint, when he's
Yeah.
singing his lyrics. Yeah, a little bit dirty, but
Well, I mean, that really applies to the next two. I mean, you've got "Giving the Dog a Bone," which, I mean,
yeah.
that is
That,
clear
that
innuendo.
is about as subtle as a mallet over the head.
I mean, I've given that one 8 out of 10. I think the first 3
Yeah,
tracks are real sort of just
yeah,
top draw, and then I think it slightly goes back a little bit. But the thing is, you sort of want that one on, on an album. You don't necessarily want every track to be this kind of like
no,
total. So I think it's quite good that the side ends with these two, which are maybe slightly lesser. One thing I noticed, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but this album contains a lot fewer or a lot less backing vocals than had
yeah,
been on Highway to Hell, because they'd never done backing vocals before. Mutt Lang got them to do them quite a lot on Highway to Hell. Think of it,
yeah,
Girls Got Rhythm, Highway to Hell. They've all got these really strong kind of, I think it was Malcolm and Cliff used to do these backing vocals.
yeah,
On this album, there's far less of that. Giving the Dog a Bone actually does have, finally, you hear this thing.
yeah.
I'd never particularly noticed that. I was wondering why it was. And I was thinking maybe it was because they wanted to put Brian so firmly in the spotlight that they didn't want to sort of try to eclipse him with other vocals going on. What do you
Yeah.
think?
That would make sense, because
Hmm.
it would. This album was the gamble, because they were all going to judge Brian, and by putting Brian voice vocals right out in front, that I think would, having backing vocals, you could mix them in, and that might take away something from Brian. So you want
Exactly.
some, if you're going to sort of like promote your new singer, you want as less backing vocals as you can, and I think that's probably why. It can be a bit funny with AC/DC and backing vocals, because sometimes it's high pitched squeals, and sometimes it's like, looking
Yeah.
for a fight, sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's just one thing that occurred to me today. So what's your take on those final 2 songs on side 1? Giving the Dog a Bone, Let Me Put My Love Into You, which is, it's a sort of moodier one. I've given it an
It's
8
a
out of
moody
10.
one. It's about as near as you're going to get to a ballad, isn't it? From
Yeah,
from a
although he does sing "Let Me Cut Your Cake with My Knife" in it, so
well,
it's a very particular kind of rock ballad, isn't
yeah,
it? It's not.
yeah. They're not the strongest songs on the first side. You are right, and I think it's quite interesting how they've got the order. Let's hook people in with the best songs,
Yeah,
and then leave the 2 weaker songs towards the end.
yeah.
Let people have a rest, so to speak, and then you flip the record over, and then we start with another great classic AC/DC track.
Yeah, I mean, I've written here 11 out of 10, and I've just put impossibly good, because it is just an incredible piece of work. I think it's
Yeah,
so. We were talking earlier, or you were talking earlier about the way Malcolm's got his part to do, Angus has got his part, and they've all got their own parts to do. This song in particular, I think they sound like a 5-man army. Just the way
yeah,
that it's just dun 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 dun. It's just, I don't know. It's so full of this kind of
yeah,
joyous intent, really, isn't it? I mean, they've
yeah,
really hit their groove. They must have known in the studio. You kind of hear these stories about bands making these incredible albums. There's that famous story, isn't there, about Pink Floyd hearing the final playback of Dark Side of the Moon and looking at each other going, "Oh my God, what on earth have we made here?" There must have been a moment during these sessions when they
yeah.
just thought, this is going to be fucking good
Yeah.
album. And Brian
Yeah.
Johnson must have been just there going, wow. I mean,
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
happening here? Like real sort of magic happening.
It's an interesting track because I don't know if you've ever picked this up on AC/DC album, particularly around that period. All the songs tended to have a crash ending, you know, a proper ending, but they always had to save one track to have a fade out. Back in Black is the one on this album.
Well, I've just written next to it, has a fade out, question mark, question mark, question mark. I'd forgotten that. I'd totally forgotten it had a fade out. And I was wondering why that was.
I
What
don't
was
know.
their thinking
There
there?
was always one track on an AC/DC album that had
Had a
around that
fade out.
period had a fade out. It was If You Want Blood, You've Got It on Highway to Hell, and Breaking the Rules on For Those About to Rock.
Interesting.
Yeah, I've never quite fathomed out, but maybe it's just a case of we haven't really got an ending. We'll make one up when we play it live.
It might have been a radio thing, you know, with the crossfades. They might have thought if we have a fade out, it'll crossfade into something, you know, on these American radio stations that just play back to back, not back to black, back to back rock stuff, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I mean, side two, track one, just impossibly good. And then I've put You Shook Me All Night Long, 11 out of 10. Again, I mean,
that was the first single off the album.
Yes. So I'm going to assume that you rate that track as well. I mean, it's a very commercial for AC/DC.
Just a great track. And then the B-side to that, which followed, was Have a Drink on Me. And that is Bon. That is the tribute to Bon, that is.
Yeah.
Because it's what Bon would have said if he said, you know, if I don't carry on.
Have a drink on me.
Yeah.
I mean, I've given that one an 8 out of 10. I think it slips back slightly behind the opening duo there, but it's still a really good track. And then I've got Shake a Leg, again, at 8 out of 10. This song I've put, you can strongly hear Robert Plant in this one, particularly at the start when he comes in singing, and you really think for a minute, wow, because Led Zeppelin, I've never quite known whether they were an influence on AC/DC or not. I suppose they probably were, but they're not a band that I particularly think of with AC/DC with this track. And I guess Brian Johnson, he's got that sort of high-pitched screech, which I guess does come from Robert Plant, doesn't it?
Really, when he comes out the sort of like the guitar solo and he begins the next, he really gives it. It's almost like his voice, his throat's just going to come out of his mouth and escape.
Yeah. I don't know. I'd never particularly picked up on it before. The sort of the Robert Plant connection there, but I really imagine heard it
Brian Johnson might have been a big fan of Led Zeppelin. I also think Dan McCaffrey of Nazareth.
Definitely, yeah. His voice is very similar.
Very similar look, but very similar type of voice. You can imagine if Dan McCaffrey had joined AC/DC at that time, that would have been the same sort of vocal style.
You can't really imagine, though, can you, Brian Johnson and the Young Brothers being too much into the other aspects of Led Zeppelin? You can't really imagine them enjoying things like the Battle of Evermore and all the more sort of Tolkien things.
That would have been just it would have been rock and roll, Black Dog, and that would have been about it on Led Zeppelin wall. They would probably agreed with Robert Plant and just binned their way to heaven.
Okay, so then the record finishes. I've got a 9 out of 10 here. I'm not quite sure why I docked it. 1, Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution. And I've put, does this lay down the template for the next album? Because it's really noticeable as a kind of slow track, which is what because the next album starts with For Those About to Rock, and it has this sort of very ploddy, almost sort of stately quality to it, which I think was going to be a direction they were going to explore a little bit.
Yeah, it was the second single off the album.
Okay.
And it was a bit of an unexpected, because it was their biggest hit at the time. Bit of an unexpected hit single, to be honest. But I suppose it's a statement, isn't it? Rock and roll ain't noise pollution. Rock and roll ain't gonna die. You could have named that song "Rock and Roll Ain't Gonna Die." It's an interesting choice of title. Rock and roll ain't noise pollution.
Does he not also sing "Rock and Roll is just rock and roll"?
It's at the end. Rock and roll is just
rock and roll. Yeah, real tautology there. I don't
know.
It
just ends the album. It's just like, all the change. We're carrying on, but rock and roll is just rock and roll.
Well, I was surprised actually at how the album does not end really on the usual, just incredible fanfare. There's no massive field rud thing at the end. It just seems to
Well,
just stop. It was like, right, okay, that's it, done.
well, there is a tendency for them to do that. I mean, Highway to Hell was Night Prowler,
Okay,
and it sort of like dies out towards the end before Bond goes Shazbot Nanu Nanu.
that's right. Yeah,
And in a way, I think for those about to rock does that as well. They tend not to do, you do a big crashing end to an album. It's just like there's the last song.
Yeah.
Take it or leave it. And
yeah, I mean, most AC/DC albums also have 10 tracks, don't they? It seems to be a thing that they like to do. 5 songs on this side, 5 songs on that side, job done, no messing about. Here's your 5, turn it over, there's your 5, now fuck off. It was that kind of thing, wasn't it? Okay, so there's the tracks. I mean, there's the album. So I've just got a few stats here. I mentioned earlier some stats. So the album comes out 25th of July 1980. Goes straight to number 1 in the UK, apparently. US number 4. So, I mean, if you imagine Brian Johnson kind of, he knows he's made this great album, but he's still wondering, is it going to be accepted? What's going to happen? Goes straight in at number 1. At that point, he must have thought, right, all my chips have come up. What's the expression? All my cards have lined up.
Yeah.
And it goes on to sell 50 million and goes platinum 25 times.
Second biggest selling album of all time.
Yeah.
25 million of those are in the US alone.
You've got Highway to Hell with Bon Scott, which is a band who are clearly on their way somewhere, like we said at the start. Bon dies, Brian comes in, Back in Black, 50 million sales, 25 times platinum. What's actually happened there? Because the album is not, 50 million times better than that album. And it's not, I mean, it's a good album. It's a great album. What's happened there?
I think it's one of those albums of that period. The biggest selling albums around that period tend to be albums of the 70s and 80s. And this is the time of format changes. And I think when you get a new audience discover you, they'll buy it themselves. So it might be people that brought the album, replaced the album, brought the CD. And then when the CD, when they like me, lose the original album, then it's one of those albums that picked up new fans. AC/DC have always been a great live band, and so they've always picked up new followers. Say for the for the album, as I said earlier, it's an album that leaves a smile on my face. It's a celebration of life, all the elements, drink, sex, just having a good time, rock and roll. It's just having a good time summed up in one record.
And would you
that's
say
why I love it so much?
Would you say it's AC/DC's crowning achievement?
I think so. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, on that note, I think we should bring the video to an end. So, thank you very much, Steve, for talking us through that legendary rock. How would you describe it? Legendary rock.
It's a rock album.
Legendary rock
album. Metal album. It's not a metal album.
All right, folks. Well, do leave a comment. Let us know what you think. Back in Black. Is it your favorite album of all time? Is it the greatest AC/DC of all time? Do you have any stories to share? Let us know. Leave it in the comments. So I'll just say thank you very much to Steve Whitty, my guest. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. And we'll see you all soon. Take care. Bye.
See you later, guys. Thank you.